Welcome back to the book of Romans. Again, I'm your teacher, Dr. Benjamin Olson. We're going to continue our study of the book of Romans in chapter 12 as we move now from the doctrinal section of the book of Romans into the practical section of the book of Romans. As many of Paul's books are divided in this way, the first half or first section of the book deals with what we ought to believe, our orthodoxy, or right doctrine, and then the second half of the book, or second part of the book, sometimes they're not equally distributed as it is here with Romans, Paul shifts to what we ought to now do, or how we ought to apply those doctrines, or the theological term being orthopraxis, or right practice. So this, and many of them begin with the same word that this passage in Romans chapter 12 also begin with, and that's the word therefore. Perhaps you've heard in your Bible study, inductive Bible study course, or your in hermeneutics course, when you see the word therefore, you should always ask the question, what is it there for? I've actually seen this a lot in sermons on this and on teachings on this, Sunday school lessons, devotionals, whatever, or even in commentaries, where someone will mention this and say, well, it says therefore, so it's based on what comes prior to it. However, many times that ends up being lip service. It's going only back to the statements about God's wisdom in chapter 11, or perhaps it only goes back to God's statements about his Paul's statements about God's sovereignty in Romans 9, 10, and 11. And I see this a lot from a strict Calvinist interpretation. But what I want you to see, though, is Paul gives us exactly what he is putting the therefore in the verse itself. So let's look at the verse. He starts out with, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Okay, you know this verse. This is a very popular verse. It's a great theme verse, life verse, what have you. But let's break it down just a little bit here. First of all, he starts out with the I beseech you, therefore, brethren. The term beseech here is really, it's from the same word or same root that Jesus uses in John 14 through 16 to describe the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, that he is enjoining them. He is coming alongside them. The term literally means to come alongside. He is coming alongside them to encourage them to the New King James, beseech, or I beg you, I think other translations might use. This is not Paul demanding something. Paul is not commanding something. There are certainly imperatives, or the Greek form of commands in this passage, but nowhere does he command them to do these things. And I think that's vital to understand this, that he is begging them or beseeching them or enjoining them to do something. Secondly, notice he calls them brethren. This is in stark contrast to Romans 9, 10, 11, when he uses the term brothers or kinsmen according to the flesh. Notice that as he talked about in Romans 11, that the setting aside of national Israel has been to your benefit, the Gentiles, in that you've been brought in as that wild olive branch. We looked at that in the last weeks or so. But look at that, where he then refers to now all of the church as brothers, as brethren, as kin, as fellow heirs of God. We've already seen that in previous passages. But notice then when he says, therefore, by the mercies of God. And I think that's key to understand what the therefore means. I believe he means because of the gospel. Because of this gospel. That's what ties the entire book together. That when Paul is saying, I beseech you, therefore I beg you, I enjoin you, therefore, because of this gospel that I've preached, going all the way back to chapter 1, all the way through chapter 3 and 4, 5, and all the way through, by the mercies of God, because God has had mercy on you by the gospel, by bringing the gospel to you, you have been saved, been justified, been sanctified, been glorified by this gospel, by this good news, because of the mercy of God. because God has had mercy on you. So based upon the gospel of God's mercy on human beings to save them, that you present your body as a living sacrifice. So this is what he's enjoining us, what he's enjoining the readers, what he's enjoining the Romans to do, or begging them or beseeching them, to present their bodies as a living sacrifice. This goes back to Romans chapter 3, when Paul refers to Jesus' sacrifice as an atonement, this atoning sacrifice that Jesus Christ made on our behalf. Instead, it's us making this sacrifice, but this sacrifice here is not required. This is not, Paul is not saying now because you're a Christian, you must now prove it, or you must now somehow do this because you're a Christian, you therefore will do it because you're a Christian. No, that's why he's begging them to do it, to become a living sacrifice. And of course, I'm not going to get into this too much, but you've heard it said probably that the worst part about a living sacrifice is that it has a tendency to crawl off of the altar. I think that's exactly what he means here, that this is a conscious, daily, even hourly, minutely decision that believers, that those who have been saved by grace, those who are justified, ought to do. To present their bodies. So notice it's the presentation that this is my presentation to God. I'm presenting my bodies as a living sacrifice. Okay, I'm not being asked to die for my faith. I'm being asked to live for my faith. Look at that. The sacrifice is holy. It's acceptable to God. Why? Not because my sacrifice means something, not because remember, I am the sinner. I am the one who deserves death. Christ's sacrifice is what I'm depending on, trusting in, believing in order to have salvation. But now my living sacrifice is acceptable to God because I am his child, because I am one of his, right? So it's acceptable this is an acceptable sacrifice to God. And I love the end of this, which is your reasonable service. The two terms here, reasonable and service, are very interesting because the first word, the word service, is referring specifically to a priestly or a sacrifice like would be in the temple, the service of the priesthood. This is a liturgical service that's being rendered. But the word for reasonable here is interesting because it's the word logizomai. It means to be reasonable, or to think about, or to logically do something, which is, I think, what Paul's real point here is, that because of the gospel, your logical service, the logical conclusion that comes out of the gospel is that you present your body as a living sacrifice, which is why he's begging them to do it. If the strict Calvinists were correct, then as our regeneration, we would be naturally inclined to want to follow God, and it would be, if you're elect, if you're regenerated, then you will present your bodies. I think that's exactly the opposite of Paul's point here. You are the one who by faith received the gift. You are now the one who by faith ought to follow in this reasonable service, this logical conclusion to the gospel, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. But notice then the second verse, I think, adds to that idea. And verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Notice here that this has to do with a change of mind. I think this is probably one of the most important aspects of the gospel, not just for justification, but for sanctification and for glorification, and that is to have that paradigm shift, to have a shift in worldview, that you're seeing something different because of the gospel. When you're presented with the gospel, the faith that is there is not just a blind leap of faith, but rather it is a change of mind. Notice here that it says, do not be conformed to this world. In other words, that your mindset, that your worldview, the things that you see and how you act should not be conformed to the way the world operates. By the way, I believe that the New Testament is consistent all throughout, that the word world means the worldly system, the system of human beings, the way of of lost persons, of lost people, and not trying to make it into the world of the church or something like that, which is many times what you'll see in many commentaries and such. But so notice the contrast here. So not being conformed to this world, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, it's not just a matter of how you act. It's not a matter of don't be conformed to this world in deed or in what you do, but rather it's the transforming of the mind, or being transformed by the renewing of the mind is what causes then the not conform to the world. Those two are opposite of one another. So in other words, look at how all of these things, the actions, the transformation, by the word transformation there is the word metamorphosis. It's the Greek word metamorphosis, which means just like a butterfly, just like anything else, is metamorphosizes, it changes its form. But he says this is by the renewing of your mind, by changing your mind, by making new thought patterns. But I want you to see this very clearly here. This is not how you get saved. This is now that you are saved. Notice this is brethren that he's speaking to. These are believers. That believers must continually, as they're laying out their body, presenting their bodies as a living sacrifice, continually challenge their mindset. That the transformation of the Christian life, being transformed into the image of his Son, by the way, go back to Romans chapter 8, that's the goal. Remember that we talked about what is the good that comes about? It's the transformation, it's becoming conformed to the image of Christ. That change in who we are, that change in person, happens through the renewing of the mind, through the changing of the mind, and making and seeing the world differently, seeing the world through God's eyes, through the lens of the Bible. It's that worldview shift that changes who we are, that transforms us. That's that sanctification process. By grace, through faith. As we follow by faith, we are changed with who we are, and that causes us to not be conformed to the world. So the way that we're not conformed to the world is not simply by living anti-world. And I think a lot of Christians get that confused. They think, well, if we just live anti-world, like the world does, if the world goes right, I'm going to go left. That's not what's going on here. Instead, it's being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And as my mind is removed, no, please don't remove your mind. In fact, I think that's just the opposite. Renew your mind. You will be transformed. And as you are transformed, then you will not conform to this world. Instead, you will be in the image of Christ himself. And then he finishes off with, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That this is the whole plan. This was the purpose. This is why Christ came. This is why Christ died. This is why the gospel is what the gospel is. The point is to get us to this point where we can be transformed, where we can have this renewal. And again, I think that's all the point in the world. The justification, the sanctification, the glorification. In Paul's mind, the whole purpose of this is that we be conformed to the image of Christ. First through justification, in that we have that alien righteousness that is imputed to us, that's given to us by Christ, that we are no longer ours. Instead, it is Christ who lives in us. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. The sanctification in this daily renewing of my mind, that I can become more conformed to the image of Christ. This is an action. This is something I do because of my faith. It's not just because of my faith, but I do it by faith. As I trust Christ more throughout my life, then I will be more conformed to him. And that perfect will of God is that we all be conformed to the image of Christ. I'm going to finish the video off here. We're just going to do these two verses because they're so vitally important to the rest of this rest of the book of Romans, because everything from here out, we're going to use this pattern, this paradigm, for the the change in behavior that he's going to be calling for. That is not just behaviorism, but it's all based on the gospel. It's all based on a continual walk of faith through the renewing of our mind. So let's finish the video here. We'll get into verse 3 in the next video.